There are times when healing means waking up to the fact that you weren't sick in the first place. There are times when healing means waking up to the fact that you weren't sick in the first place. Now, I'm not talking about literal sickness here. I'm talking about the deeper, more damaging kinds of sickness that are basically saying that somehow there's something fundamentally wrong with some kinds of people, that somehow there's something disordered, unworthy, shameful, unforgivable about some of the ways that people are created to be. And now this can be because of all too common and casual racism. This can be because of all too common traumatic experiences, violence that people suffer that's traumatic of any kind, especially early in life, that can instill in someone's psyche the belief that somehow there's something fundamentally wrong with you that makes you unworthy of basic human dignity and safety, respect, and care. But in particular today, I want to name the spiritual damage that can be done to folks who discover that they've been created to seek and share love with someone who is of your same gender, or that you've been created with a sense of your gender that doesn't fit with the strict categories that our society says are normal. The spiritual damage that can be done through all the ways that someone can be barraged with messages that there is somehow something sick or malformed about who you've been created to be. As a pastor of an open and affirming church, I have been entrusted with the stories of so many LGBTQ Christians who have shared with me the ways that the churches and the religious leaders of their upbringing told them that there was something even unforgivable about the sexual orientation or the gender identity that God saw fit to imbue them with. And all these messages in the different ways that we can receive them through our church and our culture, they can lead someone to have a deep pain in one's soul. I mean, a sense of dislocation from oneself, shame, confusion, as well as a general sense of fear, as well as frustration and anger. And all of this can lead to actual sickness and damage and endangerment and self-harm, self-medication, paralysis. And healing, then, real healing, involves waking up to the fact that you are not sick in the first place. There are times when healing means discovering that there has been this script running in our heads, telling us this nasty negative story about who we are and who we aren't. Discovering that this script is just a swarm of lies, is just a figment of a bigoted or an abusive imagination that someone else has infected us with. So there are times when healing means discovering that we can get out from underneath this script. We can step outside of it. We can discover who we actually are underneath the light of truth. Discover that you are wonderfully made. Come home to yourself, to the goodness and the worthiness of who it is your Creator has created you to be. You are a beloved child of God. You are an exquisite manifestation of the endlessly colorful creation springing from the holy source of all being. You are a child of the true God, whose eternal creative power is far, far beyond the boundaries of petty human prejudices. At your heart burns a soul that's a spark from the eternal spirit, the fierce and fabulous love supreme. So there are times when healing means waking up to the fact that you weren't sick in the first place. And in fact, you are far, far greater than that. And then we can help others discover this too. And so often we discover this together. So Amy Stevens was one of the plaintiffs in the recent case before the Supreme Court that found that workers who are LGBTQ are indeed protected from discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. Huge victory. Amy was a trans woman who came out later in her life. And she had worked for many years at a funeral home presenting as a man. So she had already come out and been accepted as a trans woman to her wife and with her friends. But there was this agonizing struggle within her about the split life that she led due to a deep fear of being true to herself in all aspects of her life. And this agony was so great that Amy came to be poised on the brink of taking her own life. And she said she felt like she couldn't go backwards and she couldn't go forwards. She was stuck. She was paralyzed. And the only way for that to end was to end her own life. But then she realized, I realized that I liked me too much to just disappear or go away. That's what she said. I realized that I liked me too much to just disappear or go away. She discovered that fundamentally, at her core, she was valuable, and that the story that she was anything less than that was simply untrue. She realized that she wasn't sick in the first place. And this freed her from her paralysis, thank God. And so she wrote a heartfelt and thoughtful letter to her coworkers and her bosses at the funeral home, where she had worked for many years, letting them know that she had to be fully and honestly herself as a woman in all aspects of her life, including her professional life. And the owners of the funeral home fired her for this, and they invoked God's commandments. But Amy, by this point, had become freed from the voice of that false god of judgment and fear that said that she was sick for being who it is that she was. And so she stood up for her dignity and her right to not be discriminated against. And thank God she did, because the knowledge of her own value and worth led her and those who then joined her to help her fight against her unjust firing. And her case became key to the larger case before the Supreme Court that has now won protections for the value and dignity of countless LGBTQ folks for generations to come. But sadly, Amy did not live to see this day. Amy died just last month of kidney disease that was not properly treated because she lost her health care when she was fired for being who it is that God had created her to be. And so prejudice, as contrived as it is, it can lead to real illness. So these weeks at church, we're learning from Jesus' healing stories. And one of the amazing things that Jesus does sometimes in these healings, a kind of theme that comes up, is his forgiveness of people. The healing is almost an after effect of Jesus telling someone that their sins are forgiven. So as we heard in our story today from Mark, where Jesus heals a man who was paralyzed and whose friends and whose family pushed and advocated for him to receive healing. It's Jesus' emphasis on forgiveness in this story that actually gets him in trouble with the religious authorities. Because this isn't just day-to-day forgiveness that Jesus is doing, where you forgive somebody for some offense that they've done to you. In those days, and still often in these days, in our own kind of cultural way, illnesses are seen as God's punishment for the ways people have sinned against God. Illness was the mark of a much deeper and more shameful kind of sin that somehow you must have committed against God to end up having leprosy or end up being paralyzed. And so what Jesus was doing was forgiving that level of sin. And for someone to presume to speak for God then in granting forgiveness for that kind of sin was itself blasphemy. It was presuming to speak for God. It's God's self. But Jesus did just that. And why? How? He was a child of humanity, and he was the Son of God, whose nearness to God led him to embody God's grace. And so he had the power and the knowledge, and he embodied it to deliver people from the paralysis of guilt and shame, a kind of fundamental sense of guilt and shame for simply being. Jesus then had the power, the nearness of God, to help us know God and trust God, and to know God's grace in such ways that then lead us to become who it is that we are created to be, all children of the living God. And so you are healed because you weren't sick in the first place. And you are forgiven because you were never guilty for being simply who it is God has created you to be. And for that I give thanks to our God.